District of Iowa, to talk to us about some issues that are really relevant to us today. Congressman, good morning.
It's good to be on the show with you.
There's been a lot of issues now talking about the minimum wage increase for working Iowans, and I wonder if you could comment on the pros and cons perhaps of that issue.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect time to have this conversation. We know that 3 days ago, January 15th, would have been the 85th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And toward the end of his life, economic justice was a huge part about what his focus was in trying to bring about economic fairness and economic justice. And one of the things we know is that for people on the margins, survival is increasingly hard, especially when the number of jobs available keep declining, and the jobs that are available, many of them pay minimum wage. When that minimum wage isn't increased over time to match inflation, it loses its purchasing power. So just this week, I released a report examining the declining purchasing power of the minimum wage, which now has 30% less purchasing power than when we increased it in 2009. So it's an example of what happens when that type of a program doesn't get adjusted to keep up with cost of living. So my bill would do two things. One, it would restore the minimum wage to a level of $10.10 an hour, and then it would index the minimum wage so as inflation changes over time, the minimum wage would go up or down with inflation so that it more accurately mirrors what's necessary to be able to buy goods and services if you're working on a minimum wage job.
It certainly would help. Now, when I was growing up, we had minimum wage jobs, but we usually progressed into something of higher importance and therefore higher pay. Isn't this what our expectation is for people starting out at minimum wage?
Sure. I mean, minimum wage is in no way a living wage, but it's been viewed as a floor that provides people with a certain level of economic opportunity. So if you look at where the minimum wage is now, which is $7.50 an hour, if you are a single parent with one child working a minimum wage job, you are earning less than the poverty level. So that shows you how stark this is. And there are literally thousands and thousands of people working minimum wage jobs with children who are by definition living below the poverty level. That's not fair for the parent, and it's especially not fair for the child.
Well, I've often thought, too, that people that are making minimum wage often have to go on some form of government assistance along with their working, even though they're working 40, 60 hours. So we are, in a sense, are we not subsidizing certain industries who do not have to pay a living wage, but can make their same profits? We have lots of companies that sort.
That's exactly what's happening. A lot of those companies that that only offer minimum wage jobs also don't offer health care, and therefore, if you don't have the funds to pay for your basic necessities, you have to look for other ways of getting by. So that's why when we don't have a minimum wage that keeps up with inflation, you see increasing demand at the local food bank. And you'll see increasing demand on food stamp programs, because those are the basic necessities people need to live. And that's why having a minimum wage that accurately reflects the poverty level is important to keep people from increasing the demand on those services, many of which are already stretched to the breaking point.
I've often wondered, too, because people argue sometimes that by raising the minimum wage, you're going to reduce employment. Employers will be hesitant to hire at a higher rate because of their costs, especially small businesses. I know what's your take on that. Is this going to have an impact on hiring?
Well, that's always been the argument, and yet it's amazing that as the minimum wage has increased over time, small businesses, medium-sized businesses have adapted and have been able to pass along that added labor cost to their customers, and that's one way that it allows people who are working those minimum wage jobs to have more income to spend. They buy more goods and services, that money circulates in the economy, and then it also tends to have a positive impact on non-minimum wage jobs, which also tend to lag behind unless there's something that addresses this challenge of increased cost of buying basic goods. And so it can have a positive ripple effect. And in fact, if you look at right now, if the minimum wage was increased to $10.10, that would mean an immediate pay increase for over 300,000 Iowans who are struggling in a tough economic environment.
And of course, fuller employment would certainly help the situation, because then the labor market would be more competitive.
That's right. When unemployment goes down, it gives people greater choices in terms of the types of jobs that they're looking for, and gives people, as I've often told my own children, it's easier to find the perfect job when you have a job. And for many people, getting into the workforce is one of the most significant challenges they have. Once they have a job and stable employment, when they go look for another job, that looks better to an employer that's looking to hire someone rather than someone who's been on long-term unemployment.
Yes. And what would you say to the argument that extending unemployment benefits and other subsidies, or increasing SNAP, for example, actually makes people dependent on those systems and less likely to go out and seek employment?
Well, it's ironic that the same people who oppose extending unemployment benefits because they don't want people to become dependent upon them are opposed to increasing the minimum wage, which would provide those same employees a better standard of living and a better way of life. To me, you can't have it both ways. It's all about economic opportunity and economic justice, and that's why I think both of these programs have a positive benefit in society.
And could you just reiterate again what your bill on the minimum wage is going to entail?
Sure. One of the things it will do is basically change the minimum wage over time from its current level of $7.50, the federal minimum wage, up to a level of $10.10 an hour. And then once it's there, it will index it to inflation, which means as the cost of living goes up, the minimum wage will rise incrementally with the cost of living, much the same way that Social Security benefits do for people who receive them.
Yes, and those of us on Social Security know that that does help.
It does.
But oftentimes it's a lagging increase. But with your proposal then, you would never really have to worry about raising or lowering the minimum wage again.
That's right, because one of the big challenges we face in addressing this loss of purchasing power in Congress is it's always a political battle for some of the same reasons we've been talking about in the studio today. So by indexing it to inflation, you get rid of the politics and you focus on the economic reality of what the minimum wage is supposed to do.
Yes, I understand. We're coming up on Martin Luther King's birthday. We're all aware of that. And I know you've got some programs scheduled for that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing on Martin Luther King Day.
Sure. I'll be attending the Martin Luther King Jr. banquet here in Waterloo on Sunday night. And then on Monday, I'm going to be traveling down to Des Moines and presenting some remarks that were included in the congressional record to Willie Glanton, who is one of the civil rights pioneers in Iowa. Her husband, Luther Glanton, was one of the first African-American judges in Iowa. I remember him very well because he was the commencement speaker at my sister's high school graduation. And I'll also be doing a number of things to observe the significance of Dr. King's impact in our country and the need to remember his life and his example as we get further and further away from the time when he was taken away from us. And that's the whole point of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday holiday, is to pause and reflect on the extraordinary sacrifice he and so many others made to make America a better country.
Yes, and reminders are good, because as new children are born and grow up and go through the educational system, if they're not reminded, they have no idea of what people had gone through to, say, get their rights to vote.
Right, just like coming out to the studio today, we both drove on Martin Luther King Drive to get here. And yet, for young people who may travel on that street, it's just a name on a street sign, and he was so much more than that. In fact, talking about poverty and economic justice was a huge part of what he focused his work on. When he received the Nobel Prize, one of the things that he said during his speech was, "The poor in our country have been shut out of our minds and driven from the mainstream of societies because we have allowed them to become invisible." And And to me, that's a powerful statement about the reality of what happens to poor people. We don't want to think about them because their plight is disturbing to us living in one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the world. He also said that the curse of poverty has no justification in our age. So those words come back to haunt us and challenge us to keep doing more to address the fundamental problems we face as a society because of poverty.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because our news media doesn't seem to cover that aspect very well. We really begin to tend to consider the people who are poor as basically they're not victims, they're really basically people who are just not responsible and who basically should be out doing something else. I would like to see people live on $7.50 an hour and see how they can support their car and their transportation and all the problems that would come up with it. So, I don't think we think deeply enough about how those problems really affect people if we, in fact, are not affected by it.
That's right, and let's just take a look at some of those myths, starting with the minimum wage. There's this big myth that everybody working a minimum wage job is a teenager, when in reality, less than a quarter of the people on minimum wage are teenagers. In fact, many of them are people who are veterans, many of them are single moms, many of them are seniors who are trying to supplement their income in their retirement age. And the same thing applies to many of the other benefits. You look at the food stamp program. There are literally thousands and thousands of veterans who aren't making enough money to get by, and they have to depend on food stamp assistance in order to feed their families. There are thousands and thousands of seniors who depend upon food stamps. So the fact that there's such great demand for those programs is more a reflection on us as a society than it is on the people who need that assistance.
Yes, I quite agree. And of course, children are vastly affected by this.
They are.
And I'm wondering what the effect is on some of these preschool programs and Head Start programs. Could you maybe comment on that? What's going on?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've been struggling with is this problem that came about because of a budget agreement that I voted against called the Budget Control Act, which dramatically cuts spending across the board in both defense spending and non-defense spending unless Congress got its work done and came up with a solution. Well, guess what? They didn't. And as a result, Head Start programs across the country were dramatically reduced. In fact, I was down in Cedar Rapids and there were 4 young women there. 2 white, 2 black, all 4 of whom had children in Head Starts. 2 of these moms were using that opportunity to further their education so they could go into the workforce, provide for their families, do everything that we want them to do. 2 others were working jobs and were able to do that because Head Start gave their kids an educational boost, also provided care for them throughout the day so that these moms could work jobs. You take those programs away, and if those moms have to provide for private daycare based on what they make, they have to make difficult choices whether it's more economic beneficial for them not to work, stay at home and take care of their kids, and become more dependent on these federal programs.
And you make a good point, because I was talking to someone the other day that said that for one child, their child care cost per month is $760.
It's really high.
And it takes a lot of labor actually to earn that kind of money.
That's right.
So, and that's another program too, is when you are concerned about the nutrition and the education of your children, if you can make more on public assistance than you can by working, given the costs of going to work, it's an important decision. It's a difficult decision, I would think.
Yeah, and what's so wrong-headed about many of the solutions that some people come up with, their solution isn't to look at the reality we just described. It's to say, let's cut funding for these programs and force them out into the workplace. Well, that's not going to solve the problem. We need to empower people to take advantage of programs so that their children are better prepared when they enter school, so that they have the economic freedom to increase their opportunity to earn an income in the workforce. That benefits everybody. The better job they get, the more they pay in taxes, and the more they contribute to Social Security and Medicare. Those are all positive developments.
What about aid to people for education advancements, or for, say, training for vocational skills or for administrative skills?
Well, it's great that you brought that up because we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's War on Poverty. And one of the big components of that was to give people educational assistance to help them climb out of poverty and find better paying jobs. One of those programs that was so important was Title I, which provides assistance in reading programs for schools across the country. So to give you some sense of how broad the impact is, in 2009, 2010, 21 million children benefited from Title I programs in 56,000 public schools across the country. We see that here in Waterloo. My wife is a teacher, and we both volunteered in elementary schools in Waterloo where those Title I programs were absolutely critical in addressing unmet educational needs. In higher education, Pell Grants were developed to give students grants to help them pay for the cost of a college education. And with rising tuition and rising student debt, one of the things you hear the most demand for is Pell Grants that help students find a way to get an education and get a job and a career that's going to support them and give them a shot at the American dream.
Yes, I know a woman who had 2 children, and she went to basically to college on a grant. Now she's working at Rockwell Collins for the last 15 years, and of course making pretty good income and paying taxes. So this stuff does work out pretty well for a lot of people.
And you know, one of the things, Bill, when you and I were growing up, these programs were in place, and my wife Carolyn and I both were able to pay for college education by working part-time jobs, getting some benefits from these types of grants and from federally insured student loans back when the interest rates on those loans was 1% to 2%, and the private interest rate, if you were going to a bank or a credit union to get a loan, was over 10%. And that's one of the things I fought against, is that was a reflection of a priority that we placed as a country on promoting educational opportunities. When I got to Congress, things had completely turned upside down. The loan rate for private loans was down around 3 or 4%, and yet the interest rate on federally insured student loans was almost 8%. That seemed crazy to me, and so I worked with my colleagues to reduce that so it was more affordable for students and they had less debt when they graduated from college.
Yes, it does seem like the cards are sometimes stacked against people for the benefit of others. I would like to bring up something too that I know you've been heavily involved in, because you talk about educational benefits. I did go partially get my education paid for the GI Bill.
That's right.
You've been very, very adamant and worked very hard as an advocate for our military that coming out, our National Guard particularly, but also military veterans. What are some of the problems that they face, and how are we dealing with that?
I'll give you a perfect example from my first term in Congress. The Iowa National Guard was deployed in the longest combat deployment of any combat unit in Iraq. And it had an extreme hardship on their families and the people in the Guard. And so when they finally were allowed to return back to Iowa and demobilized, they were shocked to find out that the Army cut their orders short by 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 days so they wouldn't qualify for an enhanced educational assistance benefits under the GI Bill. And it was something small, it was like $250 a month, but to those men and women it was a huge thing, and they had sacrificed incredibly hard. Some of them had given their lives in order to earn those benefits. And so I worked with other members of the Iowa delegation and the Minnesota delegation. We had meetings with these top-level Pentagon officials who seemed immune to the criticism of how bad this looked. And then finally, once we threatened them with legislation to overturn their decision, they finally cut new orders for all of these members of the Guard, and they got the educational assistance benefits they deserved under the GI Bill.
Well, we know that after World War II, the GI Bill, both for affordable housing for veterans and for education, really changed the whole economy of our country.
It changed my life because my dad was a World War II veteran, a Marine who served on Iwo Jima, and he came home and was able to use his status as a veteran to get the first loan for his home in Brooklyn, Iowa, where I grew up. But you just look at how that GI Bill changed higher education. And there's been great documentaries on this, but before World War I, higher education was basically only available to the wealthiest American children and their families. The GI Bill changed all of that by giving those returning veterans unprecedented access to higher education that completely changed how this country viewed higher education. And if you look at what happened immediately after that, it was the biggest economic buildup in our country's history.
I just wanted to take a break here and say you're listening to KBBG 88.1 FM Waterloo. I'm William Kay, and we are talking to Congressman Bruce Braley from the Iowa 1st District. I guess I should ask the question too, is there's a lot of health problems associated with our military and our veterans, and what's going on with that?
Well, you know, one of the most alarming health problems is the high rate of suicide among young veterans. I have been fighting this issue since I got to Congress. We have put in place a lot of programs and a lot of changes to try to educate veterans and, more importantly, their families and loved ones about the warning signs to get people into treatment, the screening devices that are used to identify mental illness, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we've done a good job of identifying the problem, but we haven't done a good enough job of treating the problem. And as long as we continue to see this alarming rate, we as a country should share in the shame that these young men and women who sacrifice so much for us are not getting the help they need when they return home. It's also the product of multiple and prolonged exposure to combat that increases the stress and the need for these services. So that's one of the big components. The other is to make sure that when veterans come home, whatever their needs, physical injuries, mental injuries, we're providing them with the type of treatment and rehabilitation so that they can restore themselves and get back to the highest level of functioning possible. You know, I've had a number of constituents with multiple amputations, including a well-known local constituent, Taylor Morris from Cedar Falls, who lost all 4 of his limbs. We have a moral obligation to these veterans to give them the best health care we can, not just because it's the right thing to do, but economically it helps us over time. Many of these young men are going to have a life expectancy of over 50 years. The more we do to restore their mobility and their function and keep them active, the less we're going to pay for their health care coverage over their lifetime the way we would with anyone dealing with chronic disease. So a lot of them are helping change the way we look at health care because they want to get back in the game. They want to do as much as anybody else can do. But we have to give them the type of devices and the support and the rehabilitation to give them full recovery to the extent that they can.
Well, I think in consideration of the Vietnam War, I'm not sure how many years that was, but we far exceeded that with Afghanistan and Iraq. And oftentimes we measure warfare in the amount of people that are actually died in combat or in military service, rather than the multitudes more that have injuries, both mental and physical, and the life that they have to lead. I know after the Vietnam War we had 58,000 casualties,
right.
But there's hundreds of thousands of people that suffer from alcoholism, drug abuse, all kinds of other problems. And of course, as you know, at that time we weren't very well regarded as veterans.
No. And that's why that shameful legacy and the extraordinary experience my father had and the challenges he had dealing with some of these same issues is why every year when we pass the Defense Authorization Act, which is what provides the programs and funding for the military, I have introduced a true cost of the war amendment, which requires the beam counters at the Pentagon to look at the life expectancy of these wounded soldiers, Marines, airmen, and be honest with the American people about what it's going to cost to provide the care and treatment over their lifetimes, and to look at the impact on the countries where war has taken place in terms of the number of people killed there, the impact on their family lives, and it goes beyond looking at just the death benefits for people killed. and the cost of the weapons and the munitions that we use in these wars. It's looking at the true cost of the long-term economic consequences for our country.
Just a question I have, that some of our senior military officers who retire after 30 years, relatively young, I understand that their retirement benefits escalate at a rate that's more than the cost of living.
Yeah, there's a lot of differences between how some of those military retirement benefits work and how the rest of government workers are impacted. And that's one of the things we're seeing more and more examination of, is the type of benefits and services available to retired military officers and how that contrasts with enlisted men and the rest of the government programs. Obviously, when people sacrifice so much for us by serving in the military, it's important that we reflect that, but it's also important for the American taxpayers to be aware of what those benefits are and make it transparent.
Okay, I think we should finish up. We're probably running out of some time, but we haven't talked yet about Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, and so forth. We should make some comments about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so important is that before, when we were talking about the war on poverty and its 50th anniversary, one of the big things to come out of that was Medicare. Before Medicare, many seniors lived in destitution. They weren't able to provide for their medical benefits in their senior years. And today we have over 50 million Americans who receive medical benefits from Medicare. It's had a profound impact, and it's one of the most popular and successful programs to come out of the war on poverty. And so one of the things that I did when I went to Congress is I was alarmed because we were experiencing the same problem with a non-senior population, with nearly 50 million Americans who had no access to health insurance coverage. That's why the Affordable Care Act became law, and one of the things that I'm very concerned about is making sure that it gets implemented properly. There were a lot of problems that developed when the website for enrollment went online and people were having a hard time getting access to it. We have demanded answers from the people in the administration responsible for getting that working. We've seen dramatic increases in enrollment numbers, and here in Iowa, we're seeing people who didn't have insurance coverage before or had really bad coverage getting access to great coverage at affordable rates. Governor Branstad and the Iowa legislature worked together, Republicans and Democrats, to help expand coverage under Medicaid. I think when the dust settles, people are going to see that this program has had a profound and positive impact on our state. But that's not to ignore the fact that there haven't been significant problems. We need to fix them, but we can't afford to go back to days when you could be denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions.
And when you talk about people on minimum wage again, if they don't have health care and say they have something wrong with their leg or their knee or some problem, they can't really afford to go to a doctor, so they have to kind of tough it out. And when they do have to go, they have to go to the emergency room, and we know that costs all of us a lot more money than the insurance policies, I assume.
It does, and then if they have a catastrophic injury or illness, a lot of them incur huge medical expenses that they can't pay, and that's why before we passed the Affordable Care Act, we had a huge problem where bankruptcies caused by medical treatment were the highest category of bankruptcies in the country.
Yeah, it may have been as much as 85%, actually. Very few people realize that, but that's the only thing you can do if you're making $25,000 a year and you owe $80,000 in medical expenses.
Yeah, we saw that with my nephew, who was 2 years old, diagnosed with liver cancer, had 2/3 of his liver removed. His young parents had really good health insurance and full-time jobs, but the non-covered parts of his care for things like deductibles and co-pays were so expensive. We had to do fundraisers for that family just so that they could pay off those bills.
And what would you have to say about our pharmaceutical benefits and the costs of pharmaceuticals?
Well, we have to continually look at ways so that people get access to the medications they need, but we've also seen this explosion in the use of drugs for certain types of illness, and we have to make sure that those are being driven by actual medical problems, not just by marketing departments in drug companies. And so one of the things we have to do is look at the fact that we spend far more on pharmaceuticals than any other country in the world, and what's driving those costs, and what factors we can use to keep these costs under control. Because one of the things that we all know is because we spend dramatically more on healthcare than any other country in the world, I think $3 trillion, we have to be smarter about how we spend money for healthcare. And that involves being honest with what those cost drivers are. So for a lot of people, chronic obesity, diabetes, congestive heart failure, these are preventable conditions. We have to do a better job of educating consumers of healthcare how they can take better care of themselves and avoid some of these huge costs.
Yes, I understand too that smoking among our population is down considerably, not necessarily what the governmental goal would be, but we still have young people that are smoking. There's a vast number of young people who have their first cigarette every day. There's quite a bit of that. So there's a preventable, that's one of the biggest preventable health
That's
care
right.
problems. And of course, Blue Zones is trying to address that issue. And I know that when you talk about the cost of Medicare, obesity, the things that you mentioned before, type 2 diabetes and all that sort of thing are very expensive to deal with, and sometimes they become chronic or long-term care. Plus, the hospitals have to invest in new just type of equipment. Tables have to be able to support 600 or 700 pound people.
That's right, and let's just talk about that issue for a second, because you have to look at the patient and their environment in order to solve their medical problems. So if you've got a morbidly obese patient living by themselves with very few family and friends in their community, they're a smoker, and they may have had an amputation because their vascular system is compromised. You can give that person a one-page smoking cessation handout, and I guarantee you they're not going to quit smoking. Unless you address their support system and realize that that cigarette may be one of the few things in life that gives them pleasure, how do you provide a support system that allows them to break that habit, get rid of their addiction to nicotine, and start focusing on their own weight problem as a huge part of their identity? You're going to have huge challenges. So we have to bring all of those resources to the table to help people make decisions that are in their best interest.
And again, it's not as simple as it seems on the outset.
It never is. My daughter is a dietitian at Allen Hospital. She's been on the KBBG talking about food choices, and knowledge is power, and we don't always make good choices, but if we keep providing people with information to help them understand why they have the problems they do and that there are choices they could make for better outcomes, it sometimes works.
And then some of us who make bad choices can always go down to the gym where we pay $25 a month too, and some people can't afford to do that sort of thing.
Or, we may start taking very expensive medication so that we don't have to address the problem we have because we don't want to focus on diet and exercise.
I'm going to change the subject entirely because another issue I think it's on the minds of people is about our privacy.
Yes.
Since Snowden has brought out the fact that the NSA is doing all kinds of things, how much danger is there that our civil liberties and our privacy is being invaded by, particularly by the government or by private enterprise?
Well, it's a big concern of mine, and it doesn't matter whether President Bush was in the White House or President Obama was in the White House. I have been very critical of the executive branch for its overreach into privacy. And, we have a tendency in this country to want to give up our constitutional rights at times of great crisis. We saw this during World War I, when we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to try to keep people from speaking out and speaking what was on their minds. We saw it during World War II with the relocation of Japanese Americans. And the big concern that many of us have is that when we are in times of crisis, it's important to remember that this country was founded on basic principles. And some of those principles include the right to be free from unwanted search and seizure, unwanted intrusion into your private life by the government. And that's why there has to be a balance between national security and protecting individual rights.
And I think a lot of us have mixed feelings about exactly what ratio about rights and privacy, where that stands.
And the big thing is to not feel like we can't even have that conversation, because that is more un-American than anything, which is that you can't even talk about these trade-offs because the national security interest trumps everything. And I think that's why now is the time, now is the place to have a long conversation about the trade-offs from these types of programs.
Well, this is kind of an interesting thing, because when we talk about Congress, we know that, most of us have observed that, wonder if we aren't really in gridlock, that one party won't talk to the other party, or if somebody has a good idea but they're in another party, you can't support that. Are we doing anything to really maybe get back to where we, it's advise and consent and collaboration to come up with legislation that's best for our nation?
We've actually seen some examples of that recently that I'm encouraged by. So the fact that we passed a budget agreement for the first time in years, the fact that we passed a spending bill for the federal government this week for the first time in years, that wasn't just a continuation of previous year's spending. The fact that we passed a water resources bill that was done with huge bipartisan agreement between the House Republicans and House Democrats. And when I stood on the House floor and I looked up at the voting tally and saw only 3 people had voted against the bill, I was shocked. So yes, there still are those opportunities, but at the end of the day, it all boils down to the type of relationships you have with the people you work with. If you build strong relationships with your colleagues in the House and the Senate, they're going to be less likely to talk poorly about you on the floor of the House or the Senate. And when they make those speeches that tend to drive people apart rather than bring people together, it's harder to find common ground. It's harder to find consensus. So I'm going to continue to do what I've always done, which is reach out and develop those personal relationships, because that's still how you get things done in Washington. And I've been able to pass a number of bills that I introduced by working with Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate to make it happen.
And particularly for people like veterans, it's very beneficial that you do that.
Absolutely. When it comes to veterans, there should be no partisanship.
Yes, I was surprised really that there was some reluctance on the part of some people in Congress to extend the benefits or to basically deal with the problems that veterans are having. Another issue too, and I just want to take a little break here and say we are on KBBG 88.1 FM Waterloo. I'm William Kay, and we're interviewing Congressman Bruce Braley from the 1st Iowa District. Can you tell us, this is something that may affect Iowa more than the rest of the nation, but the ethanol content in our fuels, could you comment on that? What's going on and what's going to happen?
Sure, there is a mandate called the Renewable Fuel Standard that was passed into law shortly before I got elected to Congress, but which we extended and increased after I was elected to Congress. And every year the EPA is required to look at the availability of ethanol and make determinations on what the target goals are for ethanol in the gas supply throughout the country. Recently, a number of us who represent farm states like Iowa were very concerned when the EPA announced it was going to roll back some of the ethanol mandate in response to a lot of pressure from big oil and big gas. And so I have testified at a hearing along with Governor Branstad in front of the EPA recently. I met with the EPA administrator, Congressman Loebsack, and members of Congress from Minnesota and Illinois this week to address these same concerns. And one of the problems we have is that in addition to corn-based ethanol, there was also mandates for advanced biofuels, for cellulosic ethanol, biodiesel, and the whole point of that was to try to spur innovation and technology to move us to the next generation of biofuels and make sure that we are doing everything we can to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. And the problem is, as I travel around Iowa, I see examples of this innovation all the time. I was at an ethanol plant in Shenandoah, which produces some of the purest forms of industrial carbon dioxide as a byproduct of ethanol production. They're using that to do amazing research and production with algae in aquaculture, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and a whole host of new things that used to only be able to be made from petroleum-based products. So this stuff is very exciting. We have 2 cellulosic ethanol plants ready to go online in Iowa. But if this reduction in the renewable fuel standard mandate becomes law, it's going to be a disincentive for that type of investment, and it's going to be harmful to Iowa's economy.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people aren't real aware that the cultivating of algae has a lot to do with supplements for farm animals.
That's right.
The other thing that always kind of baffled me about that was, we built a pipeline, and we send all of our crude oil down to Texas, and it gets refined. And so now we're getting less and less dependent on foreign. Well, so now we have actually maybe a surplus, and we ship it to Japan or someplace. We don't see any, we subsidize these oil companies, and we build pipelines for them, or we subsidize it anyway. And then the price of gasoline at the pumps doesn't seem to change much.
No, and then they'll come in and they'll attack the Farm Bill, which has a huge economic impact in Iowa. They'll attack the renewable fuel standard, which we've been discussing. They'll attack the wind energy production tax credit, which has had an enormous economic impact in rural Iowa. And so then you wonder, well, why do these same interests, how can they be good for Iowa when they're trying to destroy so many things that have had a positive impact on our state?
Well, it kind of baffles me sometimes that the same people that think that the SNAP program is too expensive don't seem to mind giving money to people who don't really seem to need it.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm talking about these big corporations. And then there is, we talk about K Street, you have this huge lobby, and it must have a terrible dramatic effect on the decisions that are made in Washington. Would you comment on that? We know the pharmaceutical industry, the energy industry, so forth, seem to have a lot of influence.
Sure, and I think that it's important to start with some basics about lobbying. Almost every group in the United States has a lobbying presence in Washington. So a lot of charitable organizations that you give money to support that are very noble in their purpose, they have lobbying presence because they want to influence public policy. So it's not the mere existence of these lobbyists that's a problem, it's the wealth behind them and how distorted it is in favor of large corporations and people who have enormous economic ability to try to influence the debate. And I think that's why transparency is so important. And that's why I've been so upset by this Supreme Court decision called Citizens United that allows these same groups to raise money secretly and not have to disclose where it comes from and then spend it to try to influence elections under the guise that it's part of some educational nonprofit foundation.
Yeah, I get really baffled sometimes by this whole confusion about what's a person and what isn't a person, for example. But I'm a political science major. To me, socialism isn't an evil, it's just a form of government. It works some places it doesn't. But I'm much more afraid of plutocracy,
yes,
which of course is where a small group of very influential and probably very wealthy and powerful people make a lot of decisions, including those that should be made independently by our legislators.
Yeah, you look at what's happened to Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union, it would be the classic example of a plutocracy in terms of very wealthy elites dominating decisions that are affecting the future of that country. But when you see the amazing difference in wealth that's starting to appear in this country and how wealthy, powerful people are doing what they can to influence public policy so they have more wealth and more power, I think that's something that every American should be concerned about.
It gets back to the concept of economic justice.
That's right.
It's not so much that everybody doesn't have to work for a living or redistribution of wealth, the people who have it give it to the people that don't. It's a matter of the playing field isn't level anymore, I think.
That's right. It's the equality of opportunity that we care about. That says that if you're a kid growing up in poverty in Waterloo, Iowa, you will have a fair shot at living the American dream if you work hard, you study, and you prepare yourself. When I was going to grade school, we had a picture of Abraham Lincoln on our report card that we got, and right below that picture it says, I will study and prepare myself, and someday my opportunity will come. And that's what I think the American dream is all about. But for many people living in poverty, having a hand up to get them on a level playing field to compete is what these programs that we've been talking about today were designed to address. I don't think the need has changed over the last 50 years. I think there's been extraordinary benefits in many areas, but we can't take our eye off the challenge we face as a country is that you can't do what Dr. King warned us against, which is allowing people, the poor, to be shut out of our minds and driven from the mainstream of societies because we've allowed them to become invisible. I think that's what our challenge is in Congress and our challenge as a country.
And again, I say that if you don't, most of us that grew up in middle class or upper middle class environments don't have any idea what it's like to struggle. Our parents have always encouraged us to go and get an education. We've always been clothed and fed. We haven't been up all night because our parents were, say, maybe having parties, playing music real loud, didn't care if we ate or not.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of things that we can't really understand because we're not in those shoes of those people. And that's another thing too, is how do we deal with economic fairness? I mean, there's so many people that really are counter to it, that don't really believe it's an issue. I don't know, is there a philosophical or even a practical program that may address this?
Well, I think that the most important thing is to go back to your core values as a person, go back to your core values as a country, and to remember that, for those of us who grew up with biblical teachings as part of what our moral fabric is based upon, the whole point about helping the poor, helping the needy, helping the sick is a large part of your response to your faith. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was such a huge part of the compact we made when this country was founded, is we're all in this together. The stronger the weakest among us is, the stronger we're going to be as a country. And I think that's what our conversation should be based upon.
Well, I'm always amazed at how if somebody finds a dog with a broken back, people will donate all kinds of money to get that dog healthy again, but won't necessarily donate money to, say, for children who are having problems with nutrition and other things.
Or a homeless person that we see on the streets who makes us feel uncomfortable, and we don't want to accept the reality that they are living on the streets because it makes us feel uncomfortable.
Well, I think maybe it's time to wrap this up. We've been talking for quite some time on lots and lots of issues. Anything that you'd like to do as a summary or a commentary?
No, I just want to wish everyone a happy Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday. There's going to be a lot of activities going on in the Cedar Valley, and I encourage everyone to get out, get involved, get engaged, and to pay it forward on behalf of Dr. King to honor his legacy.
Okay, well, once again, we've been talking to Congressman Bruce Braley from the 1st Iowa District, and you are listening to KBBG 88.1 FM, Waterloo, and this is William Kay. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me on, William.